So a little bit about the film. I won't cover too much of this because Sangen already talked about this. But yes, it was released in 2000, directed by Gil Portes, who is a Filipino filmmaker. It tells the story. The film is fictional, but it's also loosely based on the story of Walter Dempster Jr., who is the last surviving, at the time Filipino, last surviving Filipino comfort gay male sex worker, right? Who was essentially forced into sex slavery. Again, released in 2000, it made its debut on the Filipino Film Festival circuit, and then it became, and then it went on to receive lots of awards. Um, as a way of, I noticed that not everyone has seen the film, and that's totally fine. But to kind of accommodate that, I will make space for just some critical ideas and critical concepts. And even if you haven't seen the film, these can be your takeaways for the day. So, two theoretical concepts that I think are really interesting and that can potentially open up ways of interpreting the film, understanding the film. I have listed here. And one of them comes out of the work of a very prominent queer Asian American studies scholar named Martin Manalanzan. Um, and he's thinking of this concept of alternative modernities. And this other concept that I want to share with you all, some of you may have come across it before, depending on past classes you've taken. Uh, if you've taken other ethnic studies classes, you may have come across this concept. But I want to share with you all the concept of critical fabulation as a way of thinking about what the film is doing. And critical fabulation, as as of yet, has come out of critical fabulation comes out of the work of Black feminist studies, as well as like Black queer uh, scholars, right? Namely Tavia Nyong'o and Saidiya Hartman. So before I talk about these ideas, I want to just kind of point you all to the folks who are doing this kind of who are proposing these theoretical ideas and theoretical concepts. So Martin Manalanzan, this idea of comes up with this idea of alternative modernities in this book titled Global Divas. Oh my God, full title: Filipino Gay Men in the Diaspora. Um, this, by the way, is Martin Manalanzan. He currently teaches at the University of Minnesota. He is an anthropologist. Um, Here is Tavia Nyong'o, who is one of the kind of really huge figures in contemporary Black studies, Black queer studies. He does a lot of critical work on this idea of fabulation, critical fabulation, which we'll talk about in a moment. Tavia Nyong'o is currently uh, is a professor of African American Studies at Yale, where he also received his PhD. And then one more person I want to introduce to you all is Saidiya Hartman, the very, very prominent Black feminist scholar, Saidiya Hartman, who currently teaches at Columbia. She's the figure who originally came up with the term critical fabulation, a term that Tavia Nyong'o later developed further. But to go back to these two concepts of alternative modernities and critical fabulation, Mona Lanzon in Global Divas writes that he's writing about the experiences of Filipino gay immigrants in New York in the 90s and early 2000s. And this idea of alternative modernities he proposes as a way of thinking about how different people, especially like queer, in the context of his study, queer Filipino men experience modern life differently, and they experience, time and space differently, right? Modernity we tend to associate with like a certain kind of moment in time and space, right? Uh, and what he argues is that different subjects, like in the context of his study, queer Filipino men, uh, negotiates, for example, identity differently than dominance, uh, than the dominant culture, i.e., you know, uh, cis straight white people and the ways that they understand identity. Queer Filipino men, experience it differently. And then critical fabulation from Tavia Nyong'o and Saidiya Hartman refers to acts of telling stories, but sort of like making things up. And so critical fabulation is a method of creating stories, creating like fictional stories, but as a way of pointing to what is not known, like what is lost in the archive. You know, not all stories are necessarily documented, or not all stories, not all histories are necessarily documented or recorded or archived. And so, this idea of critical fabulation refers to okay, what are the creative practices uh, through which we can imagine other stories that were never recorded because they were not just because the folks in the stories were their lives were devalued, right? So like, what about the stories of people of color or queer folks, or in the context of Sadie Hartman's writing, Black women? Where are their histories, right? And we don't really have access to their histories because their histories were never recorded. They were never documented. And so this idea of critical fabulation is a really radical way of thinking about the work that storytelling does, right? In that telling stories, like, even fictional stories, is a method of imagining what histories are out there, but we're never allowed to be documented, and so we can't access them. It's a mode of like speculating on these other histories that exist, but we can't. We have no way to to grasp them or to access them. Um, and so these are just two critical concepts that I want to share with you all as a way of thinking about the film. And, in the 20 minutes that we have, or at least that I'm available to be here with all of you, I would love just to think about these different ideas and how they might emerge in relation to the film. And Sangan, you can jump in too if you want. Um, but thinking about this idea of alternative modernity is as a way of thinking about like how if, for example, queer Filipino folks experience history and modern life differently, and how critical fabulation as a method of storytelling and the ways that storytelling can help us kind of fill the gaps in the archive and fill the gaps in history. I'm wondering, like, okay, so like, how do these ideas emerge in relation to Markova? And I'll leave that up to folks to just think about. And if folks have other things that they want to point out in relation to the film, they definitely can.
Any thoughts? Anything you wanna? These are two very, philosophically and theoretically complicated, concepts. He explained it really well, but I'm sure we need some time to, really think about it.
Yeah, just to think about it. I also was struck by someone's comment in the Google Doc that they thought that the performances of the actors was really interesting. Did folks also, and you can like nod or you can, signal in some way. Did folks also think that I don't know, like how did folks react to the performances? Was it like overacted? Was it like weirdly acted? For folks who did see the film, let's talk about acting and performance.
Yeah. Um, try, and I'll ask Steph. Can you hear me?
Yes, I think I can.
I know you stand up. Or you can join the Zoom with your body.
Uh,
Hi.
Hi. So in the beginning of the movie, like when I in like the first like 20 or 30 minutes, I thought like the acting was kind of definitely like way stranger than anything I've seen before. It felt
Mm,
like they were definitely overacting a lot, but kind of as everything kind of started to settle in, it started to feel normal, and it didn't feel so forced or so fake after a long time.
yeah.
Maybe that's just because it's like a completely new like idea and kind of way of acting or that I wasn't used to, but it definitely changed over the course of the movie for me, at least.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for sharing that insight. Did other folks think that there was like some overacting, or did folks think that it took a moment to get used to the acting? slash yeah, do folks agree that the film is a little overacted at first? I noticed.
Yeah. Thank you.
I feel like a politician or something. Folks are just like coming up to the front and they have to like stand at a podium.
I I also thought that at the beginning it was kind of overacted and it felt a little bit more humorous. But
Mhm.
yeah, I think that maybe it settled in because it was showing how, like, even though they had a lot of difficulties at the beginning, they still had light in their life and they were able to still find humor in things. But then once it got more serious, the acting kind of shifted with that as well.
Yeah, totally. I really appreciate this attention to the kind of the shifts in the performance and the shifts in acting and acting style. And I think you're totally right, right? Like the as the kind of content and tone of the film shifts, the acting, the performance does follow suit. But I just as a way to also you don't have to, if you have other, you don't have to just like stand there if you. Okay, goodbye. Um, one thing that I want to kind of push on just a little bit is why, like, okay, so if the film is overacted, then I mean, like, by what rubrics is the film overacted? You know, I think like that there's a lot that's just sort of assumed when and let me preface by saying that I do think the film is also a little overacted at times. But to say that the film is overacted, right, is to kind of read the film by the standards of, like, for example, like mainstream Hollywood films, right, and the kind of understandings of acting that come in that context. Um, but bear in mind that this is an independent film produced in the Philippines by Filipino filmmakers, right? And so, the modes of performance are going to be fundamentally different in that regard, just based on the cultural context, but also the kind of economic context, the fact that it's an independent film. But this actually is a really great example of this concept of alternative modernities, right? Like not everyone experiences modern life in the same ways. How I see that is, for example, modes of performance on the level of acting, right? If like different folks experience modern life differently, then maybe that manifests in these things like film, like performance in film, right? Like if you look across just across different cinematic film traditions or film contexts, acting doesn't always look the same. And I think given the fact that this is a story about queer Filipino folks, like the different ways that or the different kind of registers that performance takes on becomes really potent and really key to thinking about the film. Um, Hollywood is often kind of held up as like, oh, this is like the epitome, like the pinnacle of cinema and movies, right? Um, like Hollywood is always seen as being on the forefront of global film culture. But not all, there are also all these like film traditions and film cultures that exist alongside Hollywood film or Hollywood cinema, but they're not seen as cutting edge in the way that Hollywood cinema is seen as cutting edge, right? So they kind of, there's some films that are not cutting edge and they kind of occupy this like other temporal space, right? Um, and I would argue that that really manifests in the acting of the film.
Also, I think we can consider so like the acting of these actors and actresses can be read as overacting in a way that these actors are not really like bakla. They are not in their real lives. They are just they are not identified as gay themselves. So in order to perform these roles that maybe they are not like entirely familiar in their actual lives as actors, they probably had to adapt some kind of they had to like overperform, especially to the Filipino audiences who know the actors actual lives, so they can see like the characters as characters. So there should be some over acting and over performance in that sense, but at the same time I think the reason why we read their acting as overacting is because we are so used to see gay men in a certain stereotypical images from Hollywood films. Like if you think about these Netflix dramas, the gay characters in Netflix dramas and Hollywood films, they have this specific like where ways of wearing their outfits, the ways of they talk is comparatively less sassy than the like Asian gay men in Asia. And there's other factor I think is something we can think about is in the United States, gay men identify themselves in terms of their gender identity. They identify themselves as a masculine, right? Not necessarily feminine. Of course, there are spectrums and diversities, but in this film, what is very prominent is they identify themselves as gay men, but they use the female pronouns, and they identify themselves as a feminine in their gender identity, not just sexuality identity. And I think that also kind of influence the way they like behave in their daily lives, which seems unfamiliar to us here in the United States. I don't know, you may have better thoughts on it, but it's just yeah.
Yeah, one thing that I want to point out, and maybe this is a bit of a stretch, well, actually, to address something that you brought up earlier, Songyan, I mean, yeah, it is interesting to read the film as like, oh, they're overacting. And again, I do read also the film as the acting is a bit overacted. Um, but also like reading the film, reading like their performances as like excessive or too much is again reading the films from the kind of through the lens of like, oh, like white Western criteria for like this is what acting looks like and this is what subtle acting looks like, right? And it's just so interesting to think about, uh, the fact that this is not a Western film, and so the performance looks different. But also, yeah, I mean, you're totally right. The film does sort of kind of play into gay stereotypes in that the actors in the film are not queer themselves, and so they like Dolphy, the main character or the main actor of the film is like a very prominent Filipino comedian, right? Um, and so he is like he is extremely or would have been extremely recognizable to Filipino audiences. Um, but the film does, yeah, operate through like really uh it does operate through certain queer stereotypes, right, that kind of inform the kind of over dramatic histrionic performances that are seen in the film, right? um but yeah, I also just want to point out that when we think about the film as pure as like, oh, this is like overacting, I mean, part of like what also comes to light there is like, well, by whose rubrics or by whose like criteria is this considered overacting, right? um I don't know, those kind of like cultural clashes are so interesting to me. Yeah, I also want to pose this question, which is, this is an Asian American studies class and Markova is a Filipino film, and I'm curious, like, well, what the fact that this film is like, what place does it have in an Asian American studies context, right? And what does it, but that also asks us to, consider like, well, what constitutes Asian American studies in the first place? And so, I mean, folks can share how they're currently understanding, given everything that you've talked about and given that you're halfway through the semester. I mean, like, what is Asian American studies? And how does this film potentially complicate those sort of criteria of what makes something Asian American? Like, what is Asian American studies?
If you want to come up, you can come up and talk to them. But you can also use the Google Doc if you just want to share.
Yeah, you can use the Google Doc as well. You can also stop. Hang on, I'll stop screen sharing. That way, folks can write and they don't have to feel the pressure of like being seen on a Google Doc.
Yeah, and I'm also showing the Google Doc and the Zoom screen side by side on the big projector. So yeah.
Hmm. Okay. The Google Doc is really just going off with people talking about what is Asian American studies. Um, Thank you all for these answers, and please continue to share as yeah, please continue typing, please continue sharing. Um, but one thing that folks' comments are making me think about are the things that are sort of taken for granted when we use categories like Asian American, right? Like to say something is like Asian American is to take, for example, like, oh, well, the US, the American, like the second half of the phrase Asian American is just sort of assumed, or it's sort of necessary for the definition of Asian American, right? Like the U.S. nation is taken for granted and is kind of assumed as a given in the context of Asian American. Um, and I want to flag that in Asian American discourse, there are these moves away from focusing just on the U.S. nation. So like Asian American studies is going in the directions of like what folks in academia call transnational studies, uh, Asian global studies, which thinks about things that happen, the kind of processes and machinations that happen outside of just the U.S. and are thinking about like Asian communities and Asian diasporas across the entire world, and not just focusing in on the U.S. nation. But yeah, I'll double check the Google Doc.
And also, I think even though this film is not set in U.S. mainland, but all of the things happen set in Philippines, especially in Manila. There is this comparison between when Japanese soldiers arrived in Manila and how they did it, and later on, like American soldiers came in, and Markova, like dating with this American soldier, and the contrast that stand out is this when Japanese soldier, the high ranking the soldier, when he found out Markova is not a woman, he was like turning to this violence and like so mad. But when the Markova was dating with the American soldier, there was this Carmen come and he asked, oh, does he know? And he knows, like Markova answers, right? So American soldiers are more open-minded to having a date with Markova, even though they know Markova is not even though Markova is a gay man, right? So I think there is this kind of the way the American soldiers with this U.S. imperialism, like interact with Philippines, which can definitely can we can categorize this film into like Asian American studies in a way that how the America is kind of interacting with Asian countries in Asia, right? So
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. What I'm hearing, Sangen, is a kind of radical reimagining of what Asian American study, like kind of a blowing up of the parameters of Asian American studies, right? Because Asian American studies tends to focus on Asian Americans in America, right? Yeah, and so there's a kind of like area designation that's implied, not all the time, but oftentimes in the kind of categorization of Asian America, right? And there's also this assumption that there are like Asian American artists and writers who are depict like people in Asia as well, and Markova is not one of them because the director is a Filipino citizen. But I think what you're teasing out is this kind of comparative. I really love this turn to comparison, right, between Japanese imperialism and U.S. imperialism, right? And the different kind of understandings of gender that emerge through those sort of comparative approaches to multiple forms of imperialism, because the Philippines was subject to both it was subject to both Japanese and U.S. imperialism, right? And so even though Markova as a film wouldn't necessarily be categorized as Asian American in a very traditional sense, there is insight to be gleaned from and through like an Asian American lens by paying attention to the multiple imperialisms that are depicted in the film between like Japanese and U.S. imperialism. And I mean, they are, you know, imperial violence is present in all those forms of imperialism, but it manifests differently,
Yeah.
right?
And here
Yeah.
in the Google Doc, one of the comments also kind of agrees with what you just talked about. In the second paragraph, when it comes to teaching a class and learning, there is difference between Asian American and Asian Americans.
Yeah.
Result of immigrant struggles in Charles interior Chinatown are more on the Asian American side. This film being produced in and by Filipino people is the Asian American spectrum, and I think this is
Yeah, totally. That's a really great point. So thank you to whatever anonymous animal wrote that as a comment. Um, I do have to say that I have to get going in a few minutes, but do folks have any comments, any remarks, any confusions that they would like to voice? Come to the front. Um, I'll pause for a moment if anyone would like to share anything else.
Can you explain a little bit before we wrap up? As you're an expert of gender and sexuality studies, can you explain a little bit about this Bakla identity, like the way they, focus on like cross-dressing, which is not very common we see here in the United States among the gay communities, but they are very, focused on like cross-dressing, and also the way they also they like live in this kind of commune kind of style house even when they are really really old. So can you just provide us a little bit of background of Bakla and the identities and
Yeah. Yeah, so Bakla actually this actually is really interestingly tied to this concept that I proposed earlier of alternative modernities, right? Alternative modernities is like not everyone experiences modern life in the same ways, and in some ways, uh, you know, for example, queer Filipino men demonstrate practices of everyday life that may, to Western eyes, not appear modern, but that's just part of their day to day life. Like, for example, so this idea of bakla, which is a really complicated understanding of gender and sexuality that is native to the Philippines. I mean, in a very kind of everyday sense, it refers to gay cis men, but it can also, in certain contexts, refer to trans women. Um, and in other contexts, it's sort of regarded as a third gender altogether. That's not related to man or woman, or tangentially related to man or woman. Um, but Bakla, in terms of its history, a lot of folks imagine it as this like pre-colonial understanding of gender that has continued to exist after colonialism, right? And it links together. So the fact that like bakla as an identity category even exists points to how, colonial understandings of gender as like, oh, there's only man and there's only woman, there's only male and there's only female. Um, I mean, there are ways that like Filipinx queer folks contest that very logic through the ongoing and continued presence of this pre-colonial gender identity, understanding of gender that is bakla, right? Now, of course, it's changed as a result of, in the wake of kind of Spanish colonialism, um, but it still exists as a category. But the thing that's really interesting about it is, in the West, specifically in the U.S., right? Gender and sexuality are often imagined as separate categories, but bakla melds together understandings of gender and sexuality together, right? So it's like bakla is both a mode of sexual desiring, but it also is a gender performance too, right? Bakla is often linked to effeminacy. And it points to like just a different, like a specifically Filipino understanding of gender and sexuality that is linked to, kind of tied to, um, and is representative of the Philippines' really complicated, multiple colonial histories, And I'll leave it at that. There's more, but I'll just leave it at that for now.
Sure. There are a lot of other things that we wanna and we have to discuss about like the Markovas being very religious. I think it's Catholic, right? Being
Yeah.
very religious, and he doesn't really like, have any problem with like being Christian at the same time being gay, right? And
Mhm.
it almost seems like he went to church every day and being kind of trying to be like forgiven and understood by God. But I know we don't have time to discuss all about that. And
Yeah, I will say that I mean that's just like it's just so Filipino, really. Like it's, cuz Filipino culture is extremely Catholic. As a result of like 500 years of Spanish colonialism, but also like, queer Filipinos negotiate that religiosity in really interesting ways. Like they don't necessarily forgo it, right? I think it's a very Western narrative to be like, oh, like religion and queerness are totally incommensurable. Like they cannot be negotiated. But you know, that's I mean that's not necessarily true in Filipino culture, especially, as well as like other cultures that have been subjected to Spanish colonialism. But yeah, I'll leave it at that for
sure,
now.
yeah, thank you so much.